Hi, third graders. We are going to start a new read aloud book. Since Mrs. Kaminsky finished Holes, which was such a great read aloud, we thought we would keep going. So before I tell you what book we're going to read, I want you to think for a few minutes about if you were a superhero, what kind of superhero would you want to be? Are there certain powers you would want to have? Are there certain things you would want to be able to do? Or maybe if you're not interested in being a superhero, what is a superhero to you? And when you think of a superhero, what do you think of? All right. So the book that I am going to read is Flora and Ulysses. Okay. And so Flora here is a young girl, and Ulysses is this squirrel right here. And while we read this story, we are going to think of a few things. So, character development. So, how can characters change throughout a story? Okay, and how can they kind of grow and learn new things and maybe change the way they behave or they think? Another thing we're going to look at is friendship. Okay, so what does it mean to be a good friend? How do you make a friend? Um, how do you realize that someone might need a friend? Okay. And then theme. Okay. So just like we did with the author studies and looking at kind of what did the author want you to take away from the book, we're also going to do that with this and see what is the overall message the author wants you to be able to take away. All right. So we're going to get started reading the first few chapters today. So Flora and Ulysses, the Illuminated Adventures. Okay, so we have the Tickham kitchen late on a summer afternoon. Happy birthday to you. What's this, Donald? This is your birthday present. It's a Ulysses Super Suction Multi-Terrain 2000X. Happy birthday! It's a vacuum cleaner. It's a Ulysses 2000X. Yep, it's the crown jewel of vacuums. It features an extra long cord so that absolutely no mess, no dirt is ever out of your reach. It's indoor, outdoor, it goes everywhere, and it does everything. Goody. You have to try it out. Turn it on. For heaven's sake, Donald, please. So if we look at her throughout these pictures, how does she feel about her new birthday present? She excited or not so much? Whoa, hey now. Take a look at that vacuum cleaner. What's it doing? What in the world, Donald? It's multi-terrain. You should try it outside. And that's how it all began, with a vacuum cleaner, really. Chapter 1, A Natural Born Cynic. Okay, so this word cynic is in the story a lot, and I'm not going to talk about what it means yet. I want you to see if you can figure it out based on what happens throughout the story with our characters and, the different feelings that they have. So, chapter 1, A Natural Born Cynic. Flora Bell Buckham was in her room at her desk. She was very busy. She was doing two things at once. She was ignoring her mother, and she was also reading a comic book entitled The Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto. Flora, her mother shouted. What are you doing up there? I'm reading, Flora shouted back. Remember the contract, her mother shouted. Do not forget the contract. At the beginning of summer, in a moment of weakness, Flora had made the mistake of signing a contract that said she would work to turn her face away from the idiotic hijinks of comics and toward the bright light of true literature. Those were the exact words of the contract. They were her mother's words. So what does her mother want her to do? Turn her face away from the idiotic hijinks of comics and toward the bright light of true literature. Flora's mother was a writer. She was divorced and she wrote romance novels. Talk about idiotic hijinks. Flora hated romance novels. In fact, she hated romance. I hate romance, said Flora out loud to herself. She liked the way the words sounded. She imagined them floating above her in a comic strip bubble. It was a comforting thing to have words hanging over her head, especially negative words about romance. Flora's mother had often accused Flora of being a natural-born cynic. Flora suspected that that was true. She was a natural-born cynic who lived in defiance of contracts. So this word cynic is starting to come up a lot. Are there any clues to help you think about what it might mean? Yep, thought Flora, that's me. She bent her head and went back to reading about the amazing incandesto. She was interrupted a few minutes later by a very loud noise. It sounded as if a jet plane had landed in the Tickums' backyard. What the heck, said Flora. She got up from her desk and looked out the window and saw Mrs. Tickum running around the backyard with a shiny, oversized vacuum cleaner. It looked like she was vacuuming the yard. That can't be, thought Flora. Who vacuums their yard? Actually, it didn't look like Mrs. Tickum knew what she was doing. It was more like the vacuum cleaner was in charge, and the vacuum cleaner seemed to be out of its mind, or its engine, or something. A few bolts shy of a load, said Flora out loud. What do you think that means? A few bolts shy of a load. And then she saw that Mrs. Tickum and the vacuum cleaner were headed directly for a squirrel. Hey now, said Flora. She banged on the window. Watch out, she shouted. You're going to vacuum up that squirrel. She said the words, and then she had a strange moment of seeing them hanging there over her head. You're going to vacuum up that squirrel. There's just no predicting what kind of sentences you might say, thought Flora. For instance, who would ever think you would shout, you're going to vacuum up that squirrel? It didn't make any difference, though. What words she said. Flora was too far away. The vacuum cleaner was too loud, and also clearly it was bent on destruction. This malfeasance must be stopped, said Flora in a deep and superheroic voice. This malfeasance must be stopped. What was the unassuming janitor Alfred T. Slipper always said before he was transformed into the amazing incandesto and became a towering, crime-fighting pillar of light? Unfortunately, Alfred T. Slipper wasn't present. Where was Incandesto when you needed him? Not that Flora really believed in superheroes, but still. She stood at the window and watched as the squirrel was vacuumed up. Poof! Thwump! Holy bagumba, said Flora. Chapter 2, The Mind of a Squirrel. Not much goes on in the mind of a squirrel. Huge portions of what is loosely termed the squirrel brain are given over to one thought: food. The average squirrel cognition goes something like this: I wonder what there is to eat. This thought is then repeated with small variations. Where's the food? Man, I sure am hungry. Is that a piece of food? And are there more pieces of food? Some 6,000 or 7,000 times a day. All of this is to say that when the squirrel in the Tickums' backyard got swallowed up by the Ulysses 2000X, there weren't a lot of terribly profound thoughts going through his head. As the vacuum cleaner roared toward him, he did not, for instance, think, here at last is my fate come to meet me. He did not think, oh, please, give me one more chance and I will be good. What he thought was, man, I sure am hungry. And then there was a terrible roar and he was sucked right off his feet. At that point, There were no thoughts in this squirrel's head, not even thoughts of food. Chapter 3. The Death of a Squirrel. Seemingly swallowing a squirrel was a bit much even for a powerful, indomitable indoor-outdoor Ulysses 2000X. Mrs. Tickham's birthday machine let out an uncertain roar and stuttered to a stop. Mrs. Tickham bent over and looked down at the vacuum cleaner. There was a tail sticking out of it. Uh-oh. For heaven's sake, said Mrs. Tickham, what's next? She dropped to her knees and gave the tail a tentative tug. She stood. She looked around the yard. Help, she said. I think I've killed a squirrel. What do you think? Did she kill the squirrel? Chapter 4. A surprisingly helpful cynic. Flora ran from her room. She ran down the stairs. As she ran, she thought, for a cynic, I am a surprisingly helpful person. She went out the back door. Her mother called to her, and she said, Where are you going, Flora Belle? Flora didn't answer her. She never answered her mother when she called her Flora Belle. Sometimes she didn't answer her mother when she called her Flora either. Flora ran through the tall grass and cleared the fence between her yard and the Tickhams in a single bound. Move out of the way, said Flora. She gave Mrs. Tickham a shove and grabbed hold of the vacuum cleaner. It was heavy. She picked it up and shook it. Nothing happened. She shook harder. The squirrel dropped out of the vacuum cleaner and landed with a plop on the grass. He didn't look that great. He was missing a lot of fur. Vacuumed off, Flora assumed. His eyelids fluttered, his chest rose and fell and rose again, and then it stopped moving altogether. Flora knelt, put her finger on the squirrel's chest. What do you think she's going to try and do? So here she is. She's bending down. She's putting her finger on the squirrel's chest. What do you think she's going to do? And what's this look on Miss Tickham's face over here? Look at her. At the back of each issue of the Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto, there was a series of bonus comics. One of Flora's very favorite bonus comics was entitled Terrible Things Can Happen to You. As a cynic, Flora found it wise to be prepared. Who knew what horrible, unpredictable thing would happen next? Terrible things can happen to you. Detailed what action to take if you inadvertently consumed plastic fruit. This happened more often than you would suppose. Some plastic fruit was extremely realistic looking. How to perform the Heimlich maneuver on your elderly Aunt Edith. What to do if you were wearing a striped shirt with a swarm of locusts descended, run locusts eat stripes, and of course how to administer everyone's favorite life-saving technique, CPR. Terrible Things Can Happen to You did not, however, detail exactly how someone was supposed to give CPR to a squirrel. I'll figure it out, said Flora. What will you figure out, said Mrs. Tickham. Flora didn't answer her. Instead, she bent down and put her mouth on the squirrel's mouth. It tasted funny. If she were forced to describe it, she would say that it tasted exactly like squirrel, fuzzy, damp, slightly nutty. Have you lost your mind, said Mrs. Tickham. Flora ignored her. She breathed into the squirrel's mouth and she pushed down on his small chest. She started to count. So think about the Heimlich maneuver, right? Is when if somebody is choking, you might do the Heimlich maneuver to push on their, body and try to get food to come out. And CPR is if someone stops breathing, you breathe into their mouth for them and push on their chest to try and get them breathing again. So Flora here thinks it's a good idea to give CPR to a squirrel. Is that something you would ever do? The squirrel obliges. Obliges. Let's read and see if we can figure out what that word means. Something strange has happened to the squirrel's brain. Things had gone blank, black, and then into this black blankness there came a light, so beautiful, so bright, that the squirrel had to turn away. A voice spoke to him. What's that, said the squirrel. The light shone brighter. The voice spoke again. Okay, said the squirrel, you bet. He wasn't sure what exactly he was agreeing to, but it didn't matter. He was just so happy. He was floating in a great lake of light, and the voice was singing to him. Oh, it was wonderful. It was the best thing ever. And then there was a loud noise. The squirrel heard another voice. This voice was counting, and the light receded. Breathe, the new voice said. The squirrel obliged. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and then another, and another. The squirrel returned. So this word obliges. Okay, if we read this section of the text. Breathe, the new voice said. The squirrel obliged. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and then another and another. So what does it mean if you oblige? Well, he's breathing, said Mrs. Tickum. Yes, said Flora, he is. She felt a swell of pride. The squirrel rolled over onto his stomach. He raised his head, and his eyes were glazed. For heaven's sake, said Mrs. Tickum, look at him. She chuckled quietly. She shook her head, and then she laughed out loud. She kept laughing. She laughed and laughed and laughed. She laughed so hard that she started to shake. Was she having some kind of fit? Why is she laughing so hard? Flora tried to remember what terrible things can happen to you advised in the event of a seizure. It had something to do with moving the tongue out of the way or stabilizing it with a stick or something. Flora had saved the squirrel's life. She didn't see any reason she couldn't save Mrs. Tickum's tongue. The sun sank a little lower in the sky, and Mrs. Tickum continued to laugh hysterically. And Flora Bell Buckham started looking around the Tickums' backyard for a stick. The soul of a squirrel. The squirrel was a little unsteady on his feet. His brain felt larger, roomier. It was as if several doors in a dark room of his self, doors he hadn't even known existed, had suddenly been flung wide. Everything was shot through with meaning, purpose, light. However, the squirrel was still a squirrel, and he was hungry. Very. Who can say what astonishments are hidden inside the most mundane being? Now look at what the squirrel's doing. All right, so now thinking about the section of the book we read today, okay, just some questions to keep you thinking about the story. What did Mrs. Tickum get for her birthday? Describe what happened to the squirrel. What does Flora do to help the squirrel? And would you do the same? Would you have taken all of the steps that Flora took to help that squirrel out? And then what does the squirrel mean that his brain felt larger and roomier? All right, so these questions you can kind of talk about with someone in your family if they're doing the read aloud with you, or if you just want to share with them what happened. These can be some questions to help you talk about what happened in the story. Okay. And I will see you soon so that we can continue reading and find out what happens to Flora. Have a good day.